Hello and welcome to another interview as part of our series on interfaith responses to climate emergency here on the Real News Network. I'm your host, Aman Azhar. And my guest today is Stephanie Kaza. She's an academic and a celebrated author of several books, including Green Buddhism, which broadly speaking illustrates how Buddhist values speak to climate emergency, the single biggest challenge of our times. Thank you, Stephanie, for taking out time and speaking with us today.
Glad to be here.
Now, let me fire away by asking you, Buddhism teaches compassion, codependence, and being one with the planet and its life form. Why then writing green in front of Buddhism in your book? Isn't it something obvious, or do we need to be told the obvious in our age?
We do need to be told the obvious in this age. Green Buddhism is really about highlighting those principles, exactly as you say. The principle of, we usually say interdependence or codependent arising, a way of thinking of things through relationship and process and not as separate objects. But the reason we need to bring this to people's attention is that very much of our economic and political reality has to do with seeing things as objects and exploiting them and using them through extraction. So there's still a lot of perception that the human beings are here to just take what they want from the world. So a shift to a more green, relational, interdependent view is really essential to taking care of our planet.
Right. You seem to be saying something which resonate with me as well, that probably one of the key problems of the world is to be found in its colonial legacy, which kind of legitimized an extractive worldview, which led to mass killings and colonization and evictions of millions of people from their homeland. Are we ready as people to come to terms with this reality and move away from it?
You know, I'm glad you brought that up, Aman. This is one of the most exciting things for me in the interfaith conversations, because these raise such powerful moral and ethical questions. We are now seeing religions and religious leaders take up these questions. It's just starting to happen in Buddhism, but in a way it's being brought to our attention by the protests against police brutality. And people are making the links between militarism, colonialism, police brutality, and how those impacts on civilization really undercut the capacity to be kind to each other and create and live in a sustainable society. So we are having quite a gift here between the climate crisis, the pandemic, and the concerns of police brutality. And one of the outcomes of that relational thinking is to see how connected these things are.
So why is it always that a tragedy has to knock at our homes, at our footstep for people, for us as people to respond to the crisis, which is even otherwise quite in the face?
Well, we're humans, you know, and we're good animals. When things are stable, you have a nice nest, you have a food supply, you don't have to confront things in the same way. Life is working. When things stop working so well, you have to pay a lot more attention and start worrying about survival. So I think this is a natural human reaction. And from a Buddhist perspective, we try not to give in to words like tragedy and disaster, because it's all a place of practice. These are the circumstances, these are the conditions we have right now, and they're as good as any for waking up and offering compassion right in the middle of what's going on.
And you seem to think that Buddhism is better placed to address the challenges of climate emergency, environmental challenge of our time. Is there a particular reason for it to be so?
Well, I wouldn't say it's better off politically or economically. Buddhists don't have that much influence on policymaking. But I think Buddhism already comes with this relational thinking, which is very useful. You could call it systems thinking, or as you said, interdependence. The Vietnamese teacher Thich Nhat Hanh uses the term interbeing, which sometimes helps people see how dependent we are on each other. Those principles are found in other world religions too, so it's not by any means the sole property of Buddhism. In some ways, I think what Buddhism can offer is a kind of friendliness to working with the other religions, and a kind of tolerance and respect and support for let's all work on this together. We're stronger in an interfaith dialogue than through any single perspective. And if you're in a country that's not a Buddhist country, really Buddhists don't have a lot of influence as a group or as an institution, as in much of Europe and North America. However, well-placed, intelligent, relational thinkers who are working from a deep commitment of compassion and a practice-based approach to their own life ethical orientation, if they're well-placed, they can make a big difference in an environmental group or a justice group. One calm person in a sea of chaos offers a lot more to the others around them. So that's a little bit how I'm seeing Buddhism have some influence, at least in the West.
Well, maybe you can then address this issue, or another horrible issue, which is if you look at what is happening in Myanmar, for example, you find the Buddhist monks involved in some of the worst ethnic genocide of our time. Then why is it so?
Well, honestly, this is an area that I would turn to other experts on. It's not something I'm deeply read about, but I think it helps us see that all humans are fallible and all religious systems can be co-opted for political and economic means. It's not something any Buddhist is proud of, certainly, and it goes completely against the main principles of not harming and not killing. So there are many other forces driving this. That's quite clear. And much as we don't really like to look at it, human beings have been killing other human beings pretty much their whole entire history. So we have a lot to learn as humans about how to live on this planet and with each other.
Do you think, actually following up on the same question, that organized religions are more corruptible?
Well, I would say organized anything is probably more corruptible, because with any group of people that have formed a company, a government, a church, a temple, there is going to be a wide range of human behavior, and many people will be motivated for the good, and some people just won't be able to help themselves and will be mostly looking out for their own self-interest. So in Buddhism, we talk about the three poisons: greed, hate, and delusion. So these are things that are part of human nature. They sound kind of sinful, but actually the way to see it is that greed means you go towards the things you want more of, and hate means you go away from the things you want less of. And delusion is just when you kind of don't know what to do and you're mostly ignorant or really confusing things. So it's kind of hardwired into our system as animals. So when you put that into an organizational context, the people who are acting out of self-interest can really mess things up for everybody else. So in my own tradition, in Zen, the first thing we really work on is what is that ego doing and get to you and getting in the way of socially, and bringing a lot of awareness, attention to that self-centered interest that we have as human beings.
Right. Could I also, shifting gears, ask you, what are some of the key barriers to climate change in our contemporary world?
Well, I've been thinking about this quite a bit and trying to think about it from a moral and ethical perspective. Obviously, there's a lot of economic things one could point to, but the two things that have really come into my mind are denial and distraction. We are so distractible right now. Just as a culture, there's a million things calling for our attention. The digital social media formats that we're part of continuously are eroding our attention. So what we really need in addressing this incredible challenge is very consistent, focused, strong attention on what we're dealing with, and also strong intention. So when we're caught in some kind of denial, like even a member of a privileged class might just think, there's no problem. I'm calm and comfortable, and so on. All of us are experiencing some degrees of denial because it's really a lot to get our heads around, and we need our policy experts and our scientists. But just even naming those two arenas to put some attention on: distraction and denial. And this is something Buddhist psychology is very good at. And we know a lot about cultivating mindfulness and intention and developing a stable, steady mind that can place its attention on what is most important.
So what you seem to be suggesting is it like more applicable in group settings and also in a very personalized behavioral settings? Or how does it happen actually?
Well, I'd say all of the above. If I'm doing climate justice work, I'm bringing my Buddhist practice into that arena. And maybe it means I bring a little bell and I start the meeting by ringing a bell. I don't talk about Buddhist principles, but I bring a centeredness and a calmness to the extent I can, so that when other people, of course, immediately go to anxiety, despair, depression, all those emotions are there in the mix all the time with climate emergency. So being aware of them in myself and in others, I'm able to hold maybe a little bigger compassionate heart, so that we can continue with the planning or the policy things we want to support and include those emotional states without letting them distract us. Just accepting that they're part of this terrain right now, and we need to work with them and keep our focus on moving towards a more livable future.
Right, which actually brings me to my next question, which is that on the one hand, we see this kind of age of this new age spiritualism, for lack of a better word, and the language of oneness and yoga practices kind of sweeping through, Western Hemisphere. At least I see it a lot here in DC, for that matter, and I've seen it in other places as well. And at the same time, the same people are also very invested in the kind of a unbridled consumption and consumerism. So how does kind of what you're saying, how does this happen? And do you think that the moral and ethical values that you're talking about kind of address this?
Well, yes, I taught a course for a while at University of Vermont called Unlearning Consumerism. And I was basing it on another course called Unlearning Racism. So what we see in the United States, maybe more than any other developed country in the world, is an emphasis on the individual over everything else. I call it the hyper-individualist society. So in being a hyper-individualist society, we spend a lot of effort on defining our identities, whether they're political or consumer or religious. And that takes away energy from building community and social engagement for accomplishing good. Now, in these protests, I've been really thrilled to see how many people were willing to come out into the streets to build community, and how in a time of social distancing, that building of community has suddenly become so much more important. And even consumerism is, we're on a whole different page now, because stores aren't open and people are trying to learn what it's like to live with a little bit less, perhaps. Now, saying that, there's a way that consumerism can feed right into denial. It just sets you up to be in a bubble of your perfect situation that has everything you need. So this is one really good arena for investigating denial. And we see many people looking at denial around many eating practices, for example. What are we eating and why? Where does it come from? Clothing practices, where are those shoes made, etc. So even while some people continue to be in a bubble, the movements towards breaking through that denial are everywhere. Seafood, sneakers, names of football teams. It's quite an exciting time. I don't think we can hold back those waves of deep questioning.
Right, and you mentioned that Buddhism is accommodating, and in terms of interfacing with other faith-based practices. Could you give a few examples in terms of how this is manifested in some of the climate action that either you've led or you've been part of?
Yes, I would say there's a couple of arenas that we could look at. One is, of course, there are Buddhist statements about the climate emergency, just like there are Catholic and Jewish and Muslim statements. So That's a really useful peer pressure. So everybody should speak up and speak up for their organizations and from their positions of leadership, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been part of this. So when somebody who represents the worldview of an entire faith tradition speaks up, this is very powerful for the world. And we've seen that with Catholicism, with today's Pope. We all cheered when that Pope was named. So, of course, Buddhism, where it's been appropriate, has participated in interfaith actions. And one of the main arenas is the Interfaith Power and Light organization, which is in all of the United States, the different states. So when they hold campaigns or fundraisers or marches or weatherization retrofits where Buddhists can participate, they do and support other people. I do know a number of Zen temples, anyway, that have put solar panels on their roofs, and it's a big thrill for everybody in the Sangha and the community to be able to see that. So those are a few things, but I would say they are all eclipsed by today's mindfulness movement. This could look like another wave of yoga, but honestly, it's been one of the most easily translatable aspects of Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist practice that's gone quite quickly and easily into schools, into business settings, even into prisons, some members of Congress. It's become quite popularized and well documented as to the effectiveness of mindfulness practice. So that's a little bit what I would call small Buddhism, Buddhism as skillful means. And that's a great gift, I think, right now. That mindfulness practice is a way to check our consumer habits or check our priorities, check our ethical compass. And I see that as a kind of a wildfire really taking off through the country and being very, very successful.
And yet we don't see a lot of political interfacing of these groups in terms of lobbying the legislative branches, municipalities, states, for instance, in terms of pushing towards greener agendas, as much as we see the influence of evangelical Christian groups, for that matter. Why is it so?
Well, you have different religious philosophies underpinning each religion. And of course, in the United States, we've long had separation of church and state, so we were supposed to be respecting those boundaries, and some churches do that better than others. They could stand to lose their nonprofit status if they lobby too much. So that's a kind of fact, a law fact. But you're right, they approach these things differently. In the Unitarian churches, for example, there is quite a bit of climate justice work going on, and they do sign on to letters and pressure senators. And I've actually sought that kind of compatible religion to see more action, because the number of Buddhists and Buddhist organizations is still fairly small. And one of the Buddhist philosophies we've inherited is a kind of long time view in which, all things will sort of work out over time, and not a non-urgent perspective. And the Christian, Judaic, even Muslim traditions too have a prophetic orientation that infuses so much. We must address these things. Justice is waiting. That's much better at galvanizing people, honestly, in the underlying Buddhist philosophy. But nonetheless, Buddhists in a Western Judeo-Christian culture do feel a certain amount of that prophetic justice call. And so they are able to use that to move the Buddhism a little more forward. And I think where we are seeing it, as I said, is more small Buddhists who are continuously taking that practice path forward in other settings. And one person I would mention that I've written about, and a recent book I did, is Joanna Macy, who for 50 years has been translating Buddhist principles in what she calls the work that reconnects. And they have been doing climate grief work and all kinds of other grief and despair, fear and rage, and using a Buddhist philosophy to transmute strong emotional states to productive action states. So that might not be named Buddhism, but it's absolutely at the center of all that work. And that's gone out all over the globe. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are using that work now.
So in your own engagement and your own research, do you think that there is adequate interfaith responses to climate change happening? Because at least in the media, we don't get to hear too much about it at all.
No, I think we could do far more. I'm not sure exactly what the best means are, but I would say generally religious institutions are a little bit timid. If you decide you're going to preach about climate in the pulpit on Sunday, there will be people that push back and say, no, I want you to stay with the Bible. Please just talk to me about the original teachings. And that happens in Buddhism too. So there's always going to be attention to how practical and applied you want to make your religious experience, and how much you want it as a refuge that doesn't deal with the outer world. That is going to be part of any religious organization. So, what I tend to encourage, because I saw the same dynamic operating at the university level, is for people who feel similarly to band together and make, for example, we had a sustainability council, but to find common cause, make community, and then together find a way to make your voices known out to the other sanghas. And I had a very interesting example of this. I was invited to do a climate training for all the Zen Center affiliate groups of the very big San Francisco Zen Center. It was about 50 groups. So all of those people coming together through doing this training with me became empowered to go back to their little communities, their sanghas all around the Midwest and the West, and talk about climate in a way they were not confident enough to do before that. So this is the kind of amplifying work we can do. Wherever somebody's already feeling a concern, wanting to do something, to have other people line up behind them helps them amplify their voice, their efforts, feel rewarded, feel it's possible. So that's one of my favorite words these days is, how can we amplify and reinforce good, positive feedback in the system that will help churches and religions and faith groups continue to do this work? And they're doing far, far more of it, actually, than they were, 30 years ago. So it's a good trajectory.
Right. And do you really think that there's enough room for religions as such in our world, which is at least the way the currency goes, is more invested in scientific or pro-scientific manner of looking at the world? Whether it has done any good or not is entirely different question. But do you feel that the religious footprint has anything beyond just signing off the research coming its way?
Well, each different culture views religion and science quite differently. And in fact, even what you're referring to as science is Western science. It doesn't account for indigenous science, which is quite different and is based in much more of an interdependent relational view of the world. I've also read some quite powerful work on Islamic science, which is different also from Western science. So what we see is there's often an objective, truth-seeking, wisdom-seeking mode in each of the religious teachings. And the more that is lifted up, the more it aligns with what Western science says. So I think, for example, in the Jewish tradition, long tradition of education, study, following the rabbinical commentaries, etc. And so it's quite an easy mesh with Western science and an easy way to make statements and so on. But I think religion is here to stay, and I think it adds a tremendous amount to people's social and cultural experience and is often a source of refuge that's very important when people are suffering. And that's where I think looking across the different religions is to see whether it's prayer or song or chanting or sermonizing or a potluck after church, these things hold the human community together and need to be reinforced. Science or no science, we have a lot we're going to be going through, floods and fires and pandemics, and anywhere the human community can stay strong and loving and kind is something to reinforce and really stand behind, even if you have some differences of opinion and feeling. It's really a gift to the world from religions, this kind of meaning making and community building.
And towards the final leg of this conversation, I can't resist but ask that the fact that there is no deity as such, like God in Buddhism, which makes it very different and unique. Does this uniqueness in any way helpful in approaching issues like nature and environment in everyday practice?
That's very interesting, and I like the way you pose it. So I can only give you my personal opinion about this, but there is a way that having a central religious authority creates more of a hierarchical worldview in which the religious leadership defers to the deity as the leader, and then usually that hierarchy is repeated on down the line. That's one way to organize a system, and it is quite effective, say in the military and in certain kinds of religious faiths. But the Buddhist, and I would say it's been reproduced in Buddhist countries. So it's not like Buddhism per se precludes this. So in Thailand, for example, and even in Tibet, there are very, very strong Buddhist hierarchies and Buddhist religious leadership. But nonetheless, removing that kind of pivot point up there at the top leads us immediately to this interdependent, mutual, co-arising viewpoint. And it takes us away from a single linear cause and effect. And that's a profound gift, to begin to understand that the things we're witnessing now had multiple causes and conditions that brought them into being over short periods of time, long periods of time, over cultural patterns, over historical acts and choices. This is the kind of thing that might give you a little more stamina, equanimity, and courage to keep going through what can just seem impossible. How do we come up with reparations for indigenous genocide? How do we come up with cultural standards when we're fighting over wearing masks? I mean, we've got some big challenges here. There's no easy answers. So trying to stay steady in the face of it, at least from a Buddhist perspective, that steadiness is based on a deep understanding and a call for looking deeply into the nature of things, whether it's a forest or a climate policy.
And I think towards the end, I will ask you, through your writings and research, what is it that small couple of things that we can do as individuals in an everyday practice that can bring us closer to mindfulness and respect towards our environment and climate and other things that confront us every day?
Well, we all want a place to begin so that those terrible feelings of anxiety and helplessness don't overwhelm us. They're always nearby. So I'll bring back that idea I said of the practice path approach, thinking of your own life as a place that you're practicing morality and ethics and maybe a faith, and finding touchstones across the day to remember it. And for most people, one of the two simplest places to go is through your food practices and your mobility, I'll call it mobility practices. How are you getting around? And what happens when you do walk and or bike or drive, to bring some mindful awareness to how you move and what it costs the planet for you to get around. And the same with the food, offering a meal blessing, perhaps, and at the same time checking where are my vegetables and fruits coming from, and what can I learn about this? Not to beat yourself up, but to practice awareness, even just naming the things that you're eating each day with gratitude and understanding how complex it is with the food processing plants, the soil, the rainforests. It's a kind of, the more you know, the more complicated it gets. But also, as I've seen, each time somebody launches into a kind of the beginning part with beginner's mind on such a path, the motivation naturally grows. And pretty soon you want more and more opportunities to be on that practice path. And they're really all around. So it's a very welcoming path, and more awareness creates more awareness. And it generally brings more good to the world, more kindness and more sustainability. When that's what we really want in the middle of this climate crisis, is how can we sustain life, not just human life, but all of life on this planet?
I wish we had more time, but that's all we've got for today. Thank you so much, Stephanie Kaza, once again for sharing your insights on the importance of Buddhist values and faith in addressing climate emergency through practice-based awareness.
It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to hearing more from your other interviews. And I think your efforts to elevate an interfaith dialogue are much appreciated.
And thanks also to our audiences for tuning in. You can always look us up at therealnews.com. For myself and the rest of the team, for now, it's goodbye and be well.